This video describes the production of this segmented bowl, which was made from trapezoid-shaped segments which were cut on a bandsaw. We describe the complete cutting of these wedges, the gluing, the assembly, and the turning on the lathe. In addition, we'll be showing a prototype version of an automated Accu-Slice system, which was used to cut the thin center ring. For this first project in this series of trapezoid-shaped projects, I'll be making a small bowl. This bowl will be about 4.5 inches in diameter, about 4 inches tall. It'll consist of 4 segmented layers. I designed this bowl in the Woodturner Pro software package. However, the Woodturner Pro software package doesn't enable me to see the trapezoid-shaped wedges. So I took the basic design and then just did some hand drawing to shade in what it would actually look like. It's kind of the pattern I'm looking at doing. So it'll be 4 layers. Each of these wedges will be cut at 15 degrees. Unlike my previous project, which I cut them at 10 degrees. I'll be using Purple Heart and Maple for 2 contrasting woods. Each layer will be about 3/4 of an inch thick. And I'll be separating each layer with probably either a Purple Heart or a Maple spacer, 100,000 of an inch thick, just to separate the layers. I'll be using my new jig to glue these up, so it should work a lot better, especially since these wedges now will be 15 degrees, an even greater angle. So by having the larger angle, it's going to slip and slide even more, so it'll be harder to glue without having a jig. But we'll see how that works out. At the top and bottom, I'll just use some standard 18 segment wedges to produce some segmented discs for the top and bottom, probably out of Purple Heart. And I may actually put a layer in the middle to give it some additional contrast. So I begin by cutting my woods on the bandsaw using the Accu-Slice system and adjusting the tilt on the bandsaw table to 15 degrees. I'm setting up my bandsaw to cut these trapezoid-shaped wedges. So the first thing I did is I tilted my bandsaw table to 105 degrees. That'll be 15 degrees off of 90. And I did that by, of course, taking my Accu-Slice off the table and then zeroing the bandsaw table against the blade. So it's 105 degrees, and I locked it in place underneath. So I'm using my Accu-Slice system with my 3-foot rail. I'm using my Accu-Stop, but I pulled the stop all the way back. I'll be using this surface as my indexing position because I have a larger area I need to catch with these wedges. And then I made another ramp for my system. This ramp is shorter than the standard system because I had to increase the angle so that the parts fly off of it as I'm cutting it. And I can make sure that my bandsaw blade doesn't touch my dust guard because it's at an angle now. And this will be my stop. I did go and change my angle. I was going to use 18 for this, 18 segments per ring for this first project, but I decided to go ahead and use 24. Give me more wedges, give me a nicer pattern. And I'm going to be using Purple Heart and Maple for this project. I'll be cutting the Purple Heart on this fence, and I'll be cutting the Maple on this fence. So let me go and cut my first cut to give me my starting angle. So again, I push the board against this fence, down across the table, and then lock it in place with a clamp. And I always clamp my boards. And I'm using a 3/4 inch wide blade, 14 teeth per inch. Now I want to produce a disc, has 24 segments per ring, and wants to be about 4.5 inches in diameter. And I put this in a standard Woodturner Pro software package and determined if I was making straight wedges, my wedges would be 0.53 inches wide. But I have an angled wedge. So you look at the average or the middle. If I took the width of the bottom and the top, add them together, divided by 2, that would give me a number, or I can just measure across the middle. So I want about 0.53 across the middle. So let me go and adjust this to get that wedge. This is the one I did previously, which you know is the right size. So again, to make these trapezoid shaped wedges, I keep using the same fence for one board. So I'll do this board and this fence, and each time turning it 180 degrees. And I'll do the same thing on this fence for the maple board. So this is my first cut. So let me adjust my stock. Like I said, I'm using this flat surface on the plate because it doesn't meet up with the middle position. So I want my plate to be parallel to the table. Okay. So I do this, push it in until it just touches the plate, lock it in place. Let me do my first cut. Now I just checked my numbers on my sheet, and to get a 4-inch diameter wedge, I need my distance to be 0.53. To get a 4.5 wide piece, I need it to be 0.59. So here's my wedge. Estimate where the center is. And I got about 0.61, so let me make it a little bit smaller. Note that I rotate the board 180 degrees between each cut. There's also a black line on each board, the entire length of the board, to keep track of its orientation. And that appears to be right around 0.59, 0.592, pretty close. So I'll go with that number. Here's my first one. So I plan on making 4 discs. So I'll need 48 pieces from each of these fences. And both boards, both the maple and this purple heart are exactly the same size. They're the same size width and thickness. And I ran them both through my board sander to get them both exactly the same thickness. And I did put a line down just slightly off center on the board, so I can keep the orientation of these as I go forward, both in cutting and in assembling and gluing. And now it's just a matter of cutting 48 pieces, each time reversing it 180 degrees. This is a close-up view at a different angle, so you can better see how the wedges are being cut. Now repeat the process on the opposite fence with the maple board. So again, the same process. Push it against the fence, down across the table. Do my first cut. I didn't move anything, everything stays the same here. It is important that you use both fences. In other words, when I'm making this piece, half the pieces are going to be from this fence, half from this fence. If I was making all one color, the same color, I'd have to cut it off both fences. Next, I have to remove the fuzzies off the piece that came off the bandsaw. Because on various edges, you do see a little bit of a fuzzy. So it's on that edge and it's on that edge, so multiple edges need to be sanded. So I find the best way to do this is just to lightly sand, using 220 grit sandpaper, just lightly sand each base, rotating it, and just go around all 4 sides, and then get the 2 edges, and that cleans it up pretty well. Just enough to get those fuzzies off the edge. If you have to, you can always do that too. So when I'm doing these, I want all the pieces with this short side on the one disc, and these pieces with the wider piece will go on the second piece. Likewise, when I do these pieces here, I have the short side, this will be the long side. So these will all be short sides and these will all be long sides, and then the second board will be just the opposite. I'll show that as I'm going along. So that's my first piece. Now if I want a white piece to go on there, I select one that has the wider bar on it. And then just do the same thing, sanding all the surfaces lightly. And that will be assembled like that. To Throughout this video, I'm speeding up various sections just to reduce your viewing time. For example, this section was sped up 5 times the actual speed. And there's the first one complete. Now you can see why it was important to have those lines on the top, so that way you can keep the orientation accurate. And that completes the assembly of these things with that slope 15 degrees. You have to put in a jig to put a rubber band on because they just slip and slide all over the place. So I need to use my jig to set these up and to glue them up. So that's the next step, gluing these up. Okay, I'm ready to start gluing up my pieces. And going from 10 to 15 degrees make quite a difference. These things slide an awful lot there. Almost impossible to put a rubber band on without putting in this jig. And I did a test run. So this is a test piece I ran, just some maple. Again, it was 24 segments, and it's near perfect. It came out really good. The angles are nice and tight. Joints are good and tight. Came out pretty good. So the system consists of 3 parts. It consists of this bottom plate, piece of plastic, an inner ring, which is very close to the actual ID of the piece I want, and that keeps the pieces from moving in and out a lot. And then I have my top piece which goes on, and then I have a screw clamp to clamp it in place once the glue's all put on the pieces. So let me start gluing this up, and I am using Titebond 3 glue. Titebond 3 glue has a setup time maybe 5-10 minutes, but these pieces go up pretty quickly, and I can glue them up in less than 5 minutes. If it was any longer than that, I'd probably use epoxy. But let's go ahead and set this up, start gluing it up. Put my pieces away a little bit, and I'll be gluing them and putting them right against this center piece for alignment. Okay, I'm using Titebond 3 glue, and I apply glue to both surfaces. In gluing these pieces up, it can be quite easy to mix up the orientation of the piece since you're dealing with such an odd shape wedge. That's why those lines on the top are very important. I use those as a guide to make sure I get all the pieces in the exact correct position. Once glue has been applied to all the pieces, I put the plastic disc on top and clamp it in place. And then I can easily put the rubber bands on without them slipping and sliding and getting out of disorientation. But it is important to use that jig to glue these up. In fact, you couldn't do it without this jig. And you notice that carriage bolt in the center keeps getting in the way of putting the rubber bands on. In fact, I probably should have used a smaller carriage bolt in making this jig. It would have been easier to put the rubber bands on. It worked out much better than my previous video, which was almost hilarious, watching these pieces slip and slide all over the place. It just keeps them down nice and tight. So they're all flat against the bottom. And then being pulled in here. So that looks really good. I got the first one glued up, and I let that set in the jig for about 45 minutes. And I took it out, and I'm ready to glue up the second one. I then use the same process to glue up the 3 remaining trapezoid segmented discs. For the top and bottom of the bowls, I need to make some 24 segment rings, all straight sides. So I returned my bandsaw to the horizontal position, made sure the blade was square with my table, And now I'll be using the two fences. Again, I put a line on my board, and I'll be going back and forth between the two fences to make these, because these are going to be the straight segmented wedges. So I have my system set to give me, again, a 4.5-inch diameter disc. That'll be a smaller ID, because I'll be using this for the base of the bowl. So once again, I'll be cutting one side, moving to the other side, going back and forth, and I want 24 segments once again. Next, I want to create an accent line, and it's going to be maple with some thin strips of Purple Heart in between the 24 maple pieces. So what I want is a combination of my maple wedge plus this small wedge, and I want that final ring to be around, say, 4 3/4 inch diameter. So let me go and cut a piece off, and we'll adjust the length accordingly. I probably want something around 0.6, 0.62, 0.63 inches long. So what I'm doing now is I'm combining my maple piece with my Purple Heart spacer, and I want this total width to be around, say, around 0.63 inches. And I got it right around 6'4", so it's just a hair too big. So I'm going to make it just a hair smaller. So now I'm at exactly 0.63 inches. And again, I'm using the two fences. My bandsaw is at 90 degrees to the table, and I'm cutting 24 segments per ring. Okay, I'm going to try gluing this up with Titebond 3 glue. That's pushing. I got 48 pieces of wood here, but I'll give it a try. I made a center piece here which fits really snug, so I should get a perfect shape piece here when I glue it up. Once again, I'm using the same glue jig I used for the previous trapezoid shaped segments. This jig just gives me nice accurate segments, and I can push them down to make sure they're nice, tight, and flat. It just works much better than my press system. And that should give a near perfect wedge. So I'm now ready to continue with this project, making this bowl from these trapezoid shaped segmented disc. So I have 4 of these discs that I made up, which will be put together in a pattern much like I drew up as shown previously. And now I got to make my other components. And I made up some segmented Purple Heart and maple, and even this maple disc with some small thin slices of Purple Heart in the middle that I'll be using. So I'll be cutting some thin slices between 50 thousandths, maybe 100 thousandths inch thick pieces to put in between these. Sometimes I might actually put, maybe 2 or 3 layers in between here to give us some detail. And I'll be using this also as an accent piece. I'll be starting off at the bottom. The bottom I have this Purple Heart ring, and I'll be putting this insert in the center of that. This insert was actually made from a part I made in the previous video. I did a video on making the star-shaped pattern disc, and I cut a circular piece out here, which will be going here, and I'll be going in the center here. I'll be cutting a groove in here to insert this down and glue it in, and then one of these thin rings will go on top of that. And so this becomes my base. I have my layers here with separating layers in between made from these various thin strips, and the top will be another piece of maple heart, a Purple Heart. Cut from here will be a little thicker strip for the top of my bowl. So now ready to cut these. I made my segmented rings, and I glued them to a piece of MDF, And now we'll take this to the bandsaw, and I'll be testing out my new automated Accu-Slice system for cutting these thin rings. I'll be cutting rings of both 50 thousandths and 100 thousandths inch thick, and in case of the top of this will be probably maybe almost half an inch thick. And so now let's go to the bandsaw and we'll cut these and get started to design our finished bowl that we'll put on the lathe and then turn. I just finished a series of 6 videos on developing this automated Accu-Slice system, which is still an ongoing project. I still have more videos and more development to do on that project. But this is the first time I'm using it to actually cut disc for a project I'm working on. So I'm beginning with a maple disc. This is an 18 segment maple disc that I'll be using as accent rings for this segmented bowl. So I'm going to start off by cutting some boards 50 thousandths inch thick. So I set my system to cut 50 thousandths inch thick boards. I locked in place. I already cut a board off to give me a flat surface. So I release, make sure these are tight, loosen my mag jig clamps. I'll advance this, my 50 thousandths plus 45 thousandths for the blade curve. And next I lock my mag jigs in place. So that's all set. And I have my stops all set, so it'll go automatically cut the disc and then reverse back to the starting position. I'm cutting with a 1/2 inch wide blade, and this is 10 teeth per inch, and I'll be cutting at 12 inches per minute. This shows cutting of the boards from the back side of the bandsaw blade. And notice the carriage goes through, it hits the sensor, and reverses automatically. Now since I was cutting that so slowly, I was cut at 12 inches per minute, which is probably way much slower than I normally cut. The finish on this segment disc is unbelievably smooth. And again, it's a 10 teeth per inch blade, cut at 12 inches per minute, and cutting very precisely, no jerking or movement of the slit as it goes through the bandsaw blade. So I don't know if you can see that in the video, but that surface is just perfect as you can get. And needs no sanding whatsoever. So let me cut a couple more pieces off here. I'll cut a couple more at 50 thousandths, then I'll change it and cut some 100 thousandths inch thick pieces. This automated Accu-Slice system is still in development, and I'm continuing to make additional improvements to the system. I'll be eliminating the mag jig clamps and putting some electric solenoids in, and the hope is to totally automate the system. You push a button and you tell it to cut 7 or 8 or 9 discs, it'll just cut them automatically. We currently have 6 videos describing the system in its initial development, and there'll be some additional videos coming out shortly. So from that disc I cut 4 discs, 50 thousandths inch thick, and 2 100 thousandths inch thick. And they came out perfect. And I just measured them. These measure like 102 thousandths, and these measure 50 thousandths. So next I want to cut this segmented ring, which has the maple spacers in between the segments. So again, we'll do the same thing. We'll probably cut some pieces 50 thousandths inch thick from this, and maybe a couple 100 thousandths also. And again, I cut 2 discs 100 thousandths inch thick and 4 discs 50 thousandths inch thick. And the surface is just unbelievably smooth on those. Just shows that cutting real slow like that and cutting nice and steady with no jerking motion, you get beautiful finishes. So next I need to cut some Purple Heart segments. Again, both 50 and 100 thousandths inch thick. From that Purple Heart segmented disc, I cut 2 discs about 3/8 of an inch thick. I cut 2 pieces 50 thousandths inch thick. I had just a small piece left, and I cut this sliver off, which is 15 thousandths of an inch thick, which is perfect. I mean, the surface, I don't know if you can see it in the video, but the surface on that is just unbelievably smooth. I don't see any saw marks hardly at all. It's unbelievably good. I assembled all my thin discs that we cut on the bandsaw into a pattern for these trapezoid shaped segmented wedges. And it's a little bit busy, but I think it looks okay. But what I did between each of the 4 trapezoid shaped segment layers, I added 3 layers of maple, purple heart, and maple to separate each of the 3 layers. And then at top and bottom, I added 2 layers of these pieces with the thin pieces of wood between the maple wedges as a contrast. And the idea I'm planning here is having everything align so that those dark lines on those pieces all align with the lines going down. So I think it'll be a little bit busy, but I think it'll look pretty good. So that's the plan for that going forward. So I'm ready to start gluing these up shortly. Now on the base, I have a piece of board, a little thicker board on the base here, and I was planning on putting this as a center, but the colors really don't match, and it may be too busy with all the other detail I have here. So I'm going to end up using this 12 segment disc, all going to a perfect point in the center, and I'll be putting that in the center on the base. So that's the plan going forward. And these all will be turned on a faceplate on the lathe, so I'm all set there. Now for gluing these pieces up, I could glue these on a lathe, but it's a little bit difficult gluing up these small layers on the lathe. The bigger pieces work fine, but these smaller layers are a little bit more difficult. So I'm going to be using my Dizzy glue jig, but I modified my Dizzy glue jig. I put a bolt through the center that I'll be using to clamp the pieces in place. When I made this jig for gluing up these trapezoid shaped segments, I had a lot less lateral movement of the wood. And I think that's because this center bolt is putting all the pressure in the center. Where when I put it in my clamp or my press, you may get more pressure on one side than the other. And I think that's why it slips and slides. So this seems to work better. So I modified my Dizzy glue jig. I just put a 3/8 inch bolt through the center. And I'll be putting my pieces of wood on here. Centering them, locking them in place, adding the layers. And then when I'm done putting this clamp on place, and then using my clamp to clamp everything. So that's the plan for that going forward. So now I'm ready to start gluing up. I'm going to start gluing up here, and I'll be starting working from the top down. And what I have here is I have my Dizzy glue jig with the larger rubber sleeves on here, and I did make this plastic disc which has some slots cut in it, and that's just to give me a good flat surface to put my boards on. So the first thing to do is get my first piece in there and center it, and then use my set screws to lock it in place. And then I'll be gluing my first piece on. And again, I will be trying to alternate I'm trying to stagger my segments in all cases. And what I may actually do is put a mark on. It's pretty hard to see the segments in this purple heart. So I just put a mark on there so I know where the middle of the segment is. So now when I put these on, I can align it according to that. After adding the base piece to the jig, I coat the entire surface with the Type Bond 3 glue. I then coat the second layer with the Type Bond 3 glue, place it on top of the other piece, and make sure it's aligned properly. And then I continue to coat both surfaces of all the remaining pieces, and then glue them up, again making sure I'm aligning that the joints all stagger. And I put just enough pieces on the jig that the glue doesn't start to set up too quickly. And then I'll clamp it, and I'll come back later and add additional layers. When adding the second disc with the purple heart strips between the maple layers, I do take extra caution to make sure that the lines line up with the previous lines. And these will line up with the trapezoid shaped segments in the future. I then add the 3/4 inch plastic disc on top, adjust the clamps if they need to be adjusted, and then apply the clamps to clamp it and squeeze out the excess glue. And again, as I'm clamping, I'm double checking to make sure that the pieces don't move. After the glued up pieces have been set for about 10 minutes, I remove the top clamp from the jig and then continue to add additional layers. Again, coating both sides with glue. As I add additional layers, I make sure that the pieces align. I want those lines on those bottom two pieces to line up with the trapezoid Purple Heart wedges. And I continue to add layers until I'm actually gluing this up in two sections, and then I'll glue the final layers together on the lathe. As I mentioned earlier, this glue-up jig is working quite well, keeping these pieces from slipping and sliding, but also clamping them thoroughly that the excess glue is removed from the joints. While that first set of segmented discs is drying, I use a second Dizzy glue-up jig to glue up the remaining segmented layers. I first of all turn it upside down because I'll be starting on the bottom and working my way up. So again, center the first piece on my jig, set my clamps, and then glue the pieces as I did in the past. This is my old jet lathe I took out of service about 2 years ago and replaced it with my Powermatic, and I use it now for glue-ups. I use glue-up because I can put a rotating tailstock on the tail end, and I can have pieces perfectly aligned when I glue them together. Once again, I add glue to both surfaces before clamping them together. After allowing to dry for about 4 hours, I'll then add the base insert on my other lathe. Okay, I'm ready to start gluing up my 3 sections. I have my base section, and I did glue the insert into the base. I cut an indent and then glued it in, and then sanded it flush. This is my middle section, and I have my top section. And I like gluing these on my lathe because everything is centered. I just want to make sure I overlap the joints. So let me go and put glue on this, and we'll glue it up. As I clamp the various pieces together, I double check the alignment and readjust if necessary. And now I'm ready to glue the top to the base. And once again, I check the alignment to try and get everything as straight as possible. Okay, I'll let that dry overnight, and then we'll turn that tomorrow. I then mounted the glued up trapezoid shaped segmented disc on my lathe, which is attached to a faceplate, and began to turn it. My preference is to use the carbide tip tools, and I turn both the outside and also the inside. I did change the final shape of the bowl slightly for my drawing because I like the different style base. After the lathe work was complete, I gave it a light sanding, starting with 220 grit sandpaper and then going down to 400, and then giving a final sanding with steel wool, and then giving a quick coat of bush oil. I will finish this bowl by giving it several coats of polyurethane finish. This is the finished product after 1 coat of bush oil and about 3 coats of polyurethane. This concludes this video on the production of this segmented bowl, which was made from rings of trapezoid-shaped segments. We cut these trapezoid-shaped wedges on a bandsaw by tilting the bandsaw at 15 degrees off of 90 degrees and cutting 24 segments per ring, and then glued them up to produce these segmented rings. And then I took 4 of these rings to put in the bowl, and I separated them with some other segmented rings just to give some contrast between the various layers. And these are all 24 segments per ring. And the top and bottom are again 24 segment rings of Purple Heart, just a thicker piece. If you have any questions or concerns on this project or any of these trapezoid shaped segments, please review the other videos on our website. We did a number of videos showing how these are made. And also, if you have any more questions, please give us a call or drop us an email. We'd be happy to hear from you. And once again, thank you for watching this video.